I have the great pleasure of introducing someone who in the Orthodox world is very, very well known. That's Vladimir Morosan, who's our next speaker. And we all know Dr. Morosan from his amazing work in, I would say, 40 years of work in the Orthodox liturgical music sphere. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right.
Sounds about right. But what you may not know is Dr. Morosan is extremely well known even in non-Orthodox circles. I know we are so at times wrapped up in what we are all doing, but he's very highly respected, and he wrote basically the book on Russian choral music. And he's acted as a consultant for professional choirs throughout the world. You know his work with Musica Russica, you know his work with Psalm, his work with Archangel Voices. His book was an inspiration to me many, many years ago, and I'm sure it was as well to you if you've read it. If you've not, I believe copies are available. It's Choral Music in Pre-Revolutionary Russia. Amazing, amazing monument to the great works of Russia, and amazingly researched, and especially for us English speakers, it's been a great source. So I'm going to keep my introduction very short because we are short on time. You know his work, and it speaks for itself, and it's a privilege to have Dr. Morosan here with us today, who's going to give a talk on Znamenny Chant setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kurt. You know, those of us that have been blessed to work in Orthodox church music for a long time sometimes take a lot of things for granted. For example, when it comes to musical terminology, the newcomer to Orthodox music is faced with a bewildering array of strange and often misinterpreted and mispronounced terms, out of which somehow they're supposed to make sense in their newly found work. One of my favorites is abikad, which was put together by someone named Lvov, or is it Lvovsky, and Bakhmetev. And then once they get that figured out, they learn that they find out about Kievan, or is it Kievian chant, which seems to be sung mostly by people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not Kiev. Then they learn about Russian Greek chant, which isn't really Greek. But the favorite and most mystifying term is the subject of my talk today. The other day, I heard a neophyte to this is a true story. I heard a neophyte to Orthodoxy inquire, is it true that in the Russian Orthodox church they sing something called zombie chant? Well, those of us who are here from the West Coast, it's about 7 in the morning, and I hope that no one here succumbs to the zombie state in the course of my presentation. And if I fall asleep when the lights are turned low, Kurt has promised that he'll wake me up. I'm going to begin my presentation today with a few disclaimers. This is a composition seminar, but I do not consider myself a composer in the Western creative sense. My training is in choral conducting and musicology rather than theory and composition. The second disclaimer is I do not read Znamenny pneumatic notation. Many years ago, when I had the honor and privilege of meeting the late Professor Johann von Gardner in Munich, he said, "Young man, you want to study Russian church music? You must learn Znamenny pneumatic notation." Well, the course of my inquiries and studies took me in a different direction, and I never did take up Professor Gardner's suggestion, so I never did learn staffless notation. So this really doesn't qualify me as a chant scholar like some of my esteemed colleagues here. But nevertheless, over the years, I've been really intrigued by some of the compositional principles of Znamenny Chant, and I'd like to share them with you this morning. Why? Well, one reason, speaking personally, is that Znamenny melodies have been used by some of my favorite composers, like Kostaisky, for example. But more importantly, they represent a remarkable and yet unknown and underappreciated system in the realm of vocal music composition, the melding together of word and melody. Znamenny Chant has the capability of taking Orthodox composition in various languages. I'll be speaking, of course, of English, of taking that composition to a new level of depth when it comes to the expressive and beautiful communication of the sacred liturgical text, both in its sonorous qualities and its cognitive theological meaning. Factors that have obvious implications for the missionary and evangelistic work that all of us as church musicians are called upon to engage in. Thus, though I'm not a composer in the traditional creative sense, I have had a bit of an experience as an arranger, as an adapter, if you will, of works created in Church Slavonic into English. And it's my belief that as regards any liturgical art, including sacred singing, creative adaptation rather than sheer creative originality should be the guiding principle of the liturgical artist, at least for a very long period of time, until the models that have been handed down through the centuries have been thoroughly understood and internalized. Then one can be fully creative, perhaps when one's mind and heart have been thoroughly shaped by the mind of the church, so to speak. And in the case of Znamenny Chant, I do not believe that it has yet been sufficiently studied or understood to the extent that any present-day composer in this part of the world could say that he or she have thoroughly internalized what it has to offer. Now, who could possibly be in a position to have that kind of experience with Znamenny Chant? I asked an old believer friend of mine if he was planning to come to this conference. And his response was very telling. What interest would an old believer have in composition? Again, in the Western sense of the word. Indeed, old believers continue to use Znamenny Chant to this day in their practical worship day to day. But their interaction with it is primarily that of preservation, not creativity. On the scholarly end of the spectrum, musicologists have been studying Znamenny Chant for about a century and a half, beginning in the 19th century, Russia, and continuing to the present day. Russian scholars, and there are many of them, Razumovsky, Smolensky, Voznesensky, Metalov, Johann von Gardner, have devoted a great deal of study to Znamenny Chant, its notation, its structure, the nature of the 8-tone system, and today, to this day, scholars in Russia and in the West are striving to gain insights into some of the oldest layers of Znamenny notation, going back to the 15th century and even earlier. And even though there remain a number of unresolved research problems having to do with interpretation and execution of different neumes and so on and so forth, but the fundamental interpretation of Znamenny neumes and their equivalents in staff notation, as far as it concerns pitch and rhythm, is well known and documented in such works as Archpriest Vasily Metalov's Azbuka Kryukovого Penia, the grammar of neume notation, and his work on the 8-tone system, the osmoglasia znamenного распева, which we will refer to today. Then as far as actual musical material, we have readily available, they're all online now, copies of all the square note chant books published by the Synodal Printing House in Russia for the entire liturgical year. You have the Obichod, which is the common hymns. You have the Octoichos, you have the feasts, you have the Triodia, and you have the Ermologia. So there's lots and lots of practical musical material. But neither of these two approaches, the Old Believers' singing of existing chant melodies in Slavonic, or the scholarly investigation and attempted transcription of manuscripts that are centuries old, have much to do or in common with what I'm going to be talking about here today. As far as I know, this is a previously unexplored territory, with the possible exception of those few Old Believer communities in this country that do sing in English. There's one in Erie, Pennsylvania, there's one in Oregon, there's one in Alaska, and possibly a few others, but those are the ones I know about. And what I'm speaking about here is an analytic study of the music-text relationship in Znamenny chant, a study that would identify the compositional principles that guided the original anonymous composers who created and refined this vast corpus of chant, and in the process laid the foundation for a fascinating system of melodic generation and melodic vocalization. There is this word, I guess, Kurt, are you here? Well, I was going to have a whiteboard to write a few things, but just bear with me. Maybe I can do it on the computer. Melodic vocalization is this Russian word raspevание, the vocalization of a text, and this is a system that surely should be of interest to Orthodox church musicians who in their day-to-day practice deal with the issue of melodic textual relationships as far as they are capable and of being communicated by voices. But also this should be of interest, I would think, to any composer, not just Orthodox, who is interested in the vast expressive potential and the relationship between melody and text. How is it then that this aspect escaped scholars, Russian scholars of chant? Well, paradoxically, though Metalov and others speak of the close ties between chant and liturgical text, all of his musical examples, including the vast catalog of chant building blocks known as pokevki, we'll have more to say about that term, all of his examples are devoid of text. And I gave you here, you have it in your handout, what's on the screen here. This is page 1 of his compendium of chant formulas. He has about, at last count, I think 600 or 700 for all the 8 tones. But you notice they are all lacking text. It just gives the melody. To our mind, this seeming methodological lapse is every bit as nonsensical as the vast collections of Russian folk songs that were made by Russian folklorists in the 19th century that were published only as texts, but without music. You know, some of you know about those collections. They went out into the field, they spent months, years writing down folk songs, and all they gave us is the text. Doesn't make sense. But for Metalov and his contemporaries, the relationship between music and text were sort of a done deal, you might say. They were interested in many other things, including, as we know, how to present these melodies in a new harmonic, polyphonic attire, how to, and they created in the process a marvelous repertoire of polyphonic choral works that continue to adorn churches and concert halls. But they were not particularly interested in how liturgical church Slavonic related structurally, or expressively for that matter, to the chant melody. These relationships were immutably fixed in the official canonical square note chant books that were reprinted edition after edition by the Synodal Publishing House, essentially without any changes. Now, things might have been rather different if the Russian Orthodox Church had undertaken the extensive reforms of text that were being contemplated around the time of the 1917 revolution, or even adopted modern Russian, which would have necessitated the re-examination of the relationship between music and text. But that did not happen, and probably will not happen in the near future yet. But for those of us here in America, who have largely accepted the necessity of singing in English and worshiping in English, this question suddenly becomes extremely topical. Now, already there's been work done in this area by our colleagues who are working in the realm of Byzantine chant. I'm speaking particularly of Father Ephraim's work at St. Anthony's Monastery in Arizona, the efforts of Father Seraphim Dides, and the yet unpublished work of Dr. Jessica Sukipalalis, just to mention a few. Quite a lot of practical work has been done by Dr. Nikola Razanovic in the realm of Serbian chant. I'm not aware of any theoretical work by him, but he's produced many, many pages and entire English adaptations of all the standard music books. But in the area of Eastern Slavic chant, emanating from the former Russian Empire, the situation isn't nearly as clear. As most of you gathered here know, there are two fundamentally different species of chant in the repertoire of the Eastern Slavs. Much more prevalent in the present day and familiar is what are called phrasal chants. Phrasal, phrasal chants. A fortuitous term introduced by our Finnish colleague Jopi Harry in his recent dissertation entitled St. Petersburg Court Chant and the Tradition of Eastern Slavic Church Singing, his major magnum opus, which I commend to you highly. It's available for free download in PDF form or in book form. Phrasal chants. And what these are, of course, if we were to describe them theoretically, they consist of one or several musical phrases, chiefly having a recitative style character, that are related to a particular pattern. And I'm speaking here of Kievan, the Russian Greek, Grecki chants, which came into use in the latter part of the 17th century, and their 19th century synthesis known as common chant, or Russian imperial court chant, the obычный or obichod chant, as practiced in the imperial court of St. Petersburg. These chants, as you know, are typically performed in harmony, which is how they sound best because they actually contain relatively little in the way of melodic interest in many cases. The musical and notational simplicity of phrasal recitative chants make them relatively easy to execute and also relatively easy to adapt to other languages, a circumstance that certainly accounts for their widespread use. But I would argue that some of the same factors that make these chants so easy to adapt to a variety of texts and a variety of languages also diminishes their suitability to serve as the best, most expressive vehicle to convey the unique context, content, and context of a particular liturgical text. Orthodox liturgical texts are, after all, so diverse, so varied, that in their content and their structure, to be adequately serviced by the one-size-fits-all approach that is typified by phrasal chants. Not only is phrasal recitative chant incapable sometimes of musically matching or emphasizing the literary macrostructure of the text. For example, if the text contains paired phrases, while the structure of a particular tone consists of 3 or 5 phrases, it cannot possibly match the structure of the text. It also cannot possibly take into account the various particular contours or inflections of individual words and phrases. And finally, just to complete the litany of shortcomings of phrasal recitative, there are times when profound ideas and concepts contained and communicated by the words flit by simply too quickly to make an impact upon the ear and mind and heart of the listener. What we may call, they have a very fast cognitive rhythm. And as an example of this, you have in your packet the dogmatic Theotokia example number 2. Let's see, this thing fell asleep. Let me wake it up. I thought we would just sing. I guess this is going to be the first singing you've done today. But let's just, we have all 4 parts, and let's stand up and sing Who Will Not Bless You, O Most Holy Virgin, in common tone 6. About like this. Who will not bless you, O most... Here we go. And... Who will not bless you, O most holy Virgin? Who will not sing of your most dear child Mary? The only begotten Son of majesty from the Father, not from you he was ineffably incarnate. God by nature he became man for our sake, not divided into 2 persons, but manifested as one in 2 natures, entreated of your and the Blessed Lady, to have mercy on our souls. Okay, thank you. What we immediately notice here is that the 3 phrasals formula of common chant tone 6 does not really coincide with the structure of the text. And we also note that you have some rather profound ideas here, and they kind of go by very quickly. So, on the other hand, as a contrast to phrasal recitative chant, we have in the Slavic, Eastern Slavic realm, we have something called Znamenny chant, which is the oldest and most melodically developed body of Russian chant. Now, Znamenny chant melodies consist of a series of individually composed phrases that are tailored to each specific phrase of text. The melodic phrases do not recur according to a fixed pattern, although they may repeat within a hymn if the text warrants it. So, essentially what you have is for every text you have a tailor-made melody that's unique to each text. It cannot be applied to a different text unless the two texts have a very, very close metrical and phrasal correlation. So in this sense, Znamenny chant can be described as through composed. Many, many melodies of Znamenny chant fit into that category. And also, the same melodic building blocks, these popievki that I've talked about, they're used in different genres of hymns. In other words, the same essential building blocks go into putting together stihira melodies, troparia melodies, irmi melodies, psalm verses, etc., unlike the system where you have a separate melody for stihira, a different melody for troparia, a different melody for prokimena, and so forth. Now, in his study, Jopihari calls this type of chant formulaic, referring to the melodic building blocks that form the various phrases as formulas. To my mind, the term formula, the formulaic chant is a convenient way of distinguishing between phrasal and formulaic, but the term formula isn't quite satisfactory for this purpose. It connotes something rigid and fixed in an almost deterministic sort of way, and it doesn't really convey the type of flexible entities that we're dealing with here. Now, the Russian term that is used for these melodic building blocks is popievka, as I've said, P-O-P-E-V-K-A, popievka, which means a movement of the voice. And the root of this word is common with the word pet, to sing. Furthermore, the word has a kind of diminutive connotation, since it refers to a small component of the chant, which is the raspiev. Okay, you see the root pet, to sing, raspiev is a chant, and popievka, which is a building block of chant. So for this reason, in our discussion today, I'm going to employ a neologism that I have coined, chantlet. Chantlet. Because it shares the root to chant, and it also has the diminutive suffix let, chantlet. Now, Znamenny chant was never officially phased out of use in the Russian Church, but it's safe to say that it represents today a rarity, even in Russia, where it continues to be sung by the old believers, the old ritualists, while in America, in English-speaking parishes, it's virtually unused, with the exception of a few oases, such as St. Seraphim's Church in Santa Rosa, that many of you are familiar with, and then those few extant or old believer communities that I already referred to. So in the remainder of my presentation today, what I'd like to do is to sketch out a methodology for working with Znamenny chant melodies, or rather the building blocks, the chantlets, in a manner that allows for the composition of new melodies in English, and thus imbues English texts with some of the same positive qualities that characterize Old Church Slavonic texts set to Znamenny chant. And these are a phrase-by-phrase matching of the macro structures of the text to the musical structures, the proper inflection of individual words and phrases, the microstructures, the highlighting of important words by means of melismas, called fitas, and a slightly slower cognitive rhythm of the text, which allows the meaning of the text to be absorbed more readily by the listener, worshiper. Now, I want to emphasize that this is just an initial exploration. one designed more than anything else to set minds to thinking and conversations going rather than being anything definitive. As I mentioned before, there have been some previous attempts to adapt Znamenny chant melodies with varying degrees of success. And in the course of our discussion, we will refer to these examples not necessarily to criticize them in a negative way, but to simply see what lessons they may offer in terms of refining our terminology. And as our working example, we will continue to work with the Resurrection of Theotokia Dogmatica in Tone 6. Now, the first thing that we must do when making an adaptation of a liturgical hymn is to pick a good and accurate translation. There, I said it. It's a loaded topic, I know. And in many cases, we as individual church musicians serving in a particular parish or jurisdiction really have no choice in the matter. Nevertheless, being the idealist that I am, I just felt I had to say that. And in this instance, we do in fact have a new and in many respects superior translation that was made available to us by Father Benedict Churchill of St. Vladimir Seminary, who is in the process of making a new translation of the entire Resurrectional Octoicus for the OCA Department of Liturgical Music. On your handout, example number 3, you have first the translation we just sang at the top here, and then Father Benedict's translation. So you can, that's Father Benedict's, that's the previous one we sang. What I've done here is to arrange this vis-a-vis the Church Slavonic division into phrases. And what we see, first of all, right off the bat, is that the English translation we sang a moment ago has 9 phrases, while the Church Slavonic text, as it stands in standard chant books, contains 12 phrases. Well, problem number 1. In the second instance, we've taken the English translation, Father Benedict's translation, and divided it in a manner that matches the Slavonic more closely, not exactly, but more closely in the number of phrases. And this allows us to look at the macro structure of the Dogmatican text and become aware of some of its general structural characteristics. As you can see, we have an introduction, and then a prayerful conclusion. And in between, there are 3 dogmatic statements. A main one that serves as an answer to the 2 rhetorical questions posed in the introduction, and then 2, what I might call dogmatic elaborations, both of which are stated in the form of paradoxes having to do with the incarnation of Christ. So a successful musical setting would do well to take this macrostructure into account and magnify it somehow by musical means, calling it to the attention of the hearer. On page 2 of example number 3, I've arranged the lines line by line and identified the numbers of syllables in each phrase, and then also the microstructure, which consists of the patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. As you can see, in a few cases, there are fairly close correlation between the number of syllables in the English and the Slavonic, and in other cases, there is a fairly significant difference, and of course, the accentuation patterns do not always coincide. So these become sort of challenges that we have to take on when we try to adapt the English to an extant or to a given Znamenny melody. We're going to see that the Znamenny system allows us to change that melody. But what we need to evaluate is whether our English text fits not only the overall melody, but how well the individual English words and syllables are compatible with the specific Znamenny chantlets that we are dealing with. Now here it would be appropriate to mention some of the ways in which previous efforts to adapt Znamenny chants into English have fallen short. The first faulty approach is to simply take the melody, which is a beautiful and fairly melismatic melody in its entirety, and simply to insert English syllables where it seems appropriate. And this can be done with more or less skill. But in your example number 4, you have exactly an illustration of such an approach. Now, there are numerous specific observations we could make about this adaptation here, but generally we can say that it's done fairly skillfully, but there are some things that can be improved upon, and those we will point out as we continue looking at it phrase by phrase. The second major problem occurs when one ignores the syntax or orthographic rules of Znamenny notation, such as splitting a single neum or a chantlet to fit the English syllables in a place where it's impossible to do this using neum notation. Now, neum notation has signs that mean 1 pitch, 2 pitches, 3 pitches, and sometimes 4 or more pitches. And what is not appropriate, we can quote one of our North American Znamenny chant experts, Nikita Simmons. He says, "I have seen a lot of travesties unwittingly committed by people who don't understand that, for example, a certain multi-note motif, which is represented by a single neum, cannot be split into separate notes over 2 or more syllables." And that statement needs to be kind of internalized, because our first question might say, well, why can't it be split? Why not? As you work more and more with these chantlets, you realize that there is a deep wisdom, there's a deep reason why some chantlets only work a certain way, and others perhaps do lend themselves to a little more flexibility and can be, if you see a certain pattern in the Slavonic that has a variety of different syllabifications applied to it, that gives you flexibility to do the same in English. But in other cases, you find that a certain pattern only has a certain pattern of syllables, or cannot be divided, you understand, cannot be divided into 2 syllables where it's a 1 syllable. And it ultimately has to do with the vocal performance, the vocal execution of that melodic turn. Obviously, to really zero in on this problem, the knowledge of Znamenny neum notation is extremely helpful. Although some of these rules can be discerned by a careful reading of Znamenny hymns in staff notation as well. Now, given my limited knowledge of Znamenny staff notation, of staffless Znamenny notation rather, part of my preparation in this task of adapting the Tone 6 Dogmatica, I reached into the most readily available and accessible repository of Znamenny melodies available to me. And this was the square note Octoichos, which contains all the resurrectional stichira in all 8 tones for small vespers, great vespers, the resurrectional troparion and Theotokian, the gradual antiphons at matins, the canon, and the stichira at the praises. Essentially the resurrectional hymns for the 8 tones, altogether about 50 hymns. I could have also, but I didn't in this case, consult all the hymns found in the Festolinaeon and the Lenten and flowery triolia, which would have given me even more examples. But I had about 50 to work with. And so, just to give you an idea of what I was working with, example 5 in your packet is the 2 pages from the Octoichus that has right here our Theotokia Dogmatica in tone 6. And then example number 6 is a transcription of that very same hymn into staff notation in treble clef, which is more familiar than alto clef, which is the standard notation used for the chant books. So I began by trying to develop an intimate familiarity with the 84 chantlets that Metalov lists in his Osmoglassia, that first volume I referred to, where he gives systematically an inventory of the chantlets for all 8 tones, and to become familiar with these 84 chantlets used in tone 6, and with the idea of using his index to identify which chantlet occurs where in the different hymns. But this was very difficult to do because, first of all, Metalov doesn't list them in any particular useful order or in any logical level of complexity. I stared and stared at his index and tried to discern a method there, and I couldn't. His listing could definitely be improved by grouping certain chantlets together, of categorizing them by length, by starting and ending pitch. Just, he did absolutely astounding pioneering work, but there are some things that can be improved upon. But the greatest factor that limited the usefulness of Metalov, as I said before, is the lack of text. So you look at all these formulas and you have no idea what text they go with. So the next step was to lay out the 22 musical subphrases. We mentioned that there are 12 phrases, but there are, in the chant book, you see here, these bar lines actually indicate the bar line here, 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 everywhere. If you apply that to the Theotokia Dogmatica, you get 22 subphrases. And I laid them all out in finale. And then I went through the Octoichus hymns in tone 6, and to find occurrences of similar chantlets found in the hymns of tone 6, along with their text underlay, which demonstrated and documented for me the valid variants. I use that term valid. It's a term that Jessica Suki-Palalis uses a lot in her discussion. She says, I use this chant formula and it's valid. Why? Because I can find an example in the Greek use of how this is used with a particular combination of syllables. That makes it valid, okay? So same idea here. I validated it in arranging it here. Okay, here we have the first phrase. And as you can see, there's nothing below it because this is kind of a unique phrase. It doesn't occur anywhere else in recognizable fashion in tone 6. But here, the second phrase, you see, this isn't even a complete list, but these are all the multiple variants of this noon here that's called a pauk veliki. Okay, we'll say a few more words about that, and similarly going on. Again, some chantlets have few occurrences, Others have a great many occurrences. This one happens to be one of the most commonly occurring ones in tone 6. But with this tool here, one very important tool was missing, and that's a comprehensive list of chantlets arranged by number of syllables and categorized by their accentuation patterns, as well as starting and ending pitch, whether the chantlet is a beginning, middle, or ending formula in the construction of hymns, categories that are outlined by Mitalov, and also used, if you're familiar with Father Ephraim's work at St. Anthony's Monastery, and those, but you have to know Byzantine notation, he gives such a chart of all the possible formulas with all the possible accentuation patterns. And then if you dig around enough on the website there, you find a sample lesson where he actually takes you through how he applies all these formulas in the composition of a brand new hymn in English, or let's put it this way, a new adaptation or composition, if you will, of a text in English using this formula, this methodology. So this is what we tried to do here, and your example 8, you see there are 2-syllable chantlets that have, for example, the 0 is an unaccented syllable, 1 is an accented syllable. So you have short, long, long, short, or strong, weak, et cetera, weak, strong. So as we multiply these 3-syllable chantlets, you get more possibilities: strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak, strong, and so forth. And 4-syllable chantlets. Again, the possibilities multiply, and this is basically as far as I got. So this kind of chart would serve as a guide for instances when an English phrase differs markedly from the Slavonic antecedent or its counterpart, or, which is an important point, when a new hymn has to be composed entirely in English, for which there is no Slavonic or Greek antecedent. And as we know from history, that's when scholars have identified a major push in the development of Russian chant composition, was when Russia canonized its first saints, and they didn't have Greek antecedents to follow, and they had to compose new melodies for the Russian saints, and so chant composition took a major kind of leap, if you will, in Russia. This, by the way, entails a lot of cutting and pasting of PDF files in InDesign. Those of you that are familiar with those programs, it's a bit of a drudge work, but the beauty of it is once it's done, and you can take them and kind of move them around, cut and paste, and organize it into some sort of useful structure. So, working in this manner with the chantlets demonstrates that Znamenny chant is an absolutely remarkable traditional system of resources, worked out over many centuries for writing flowing, mostly stepwise, properly inflected melodies for virtually every possible combination and pattern of textual syllables. Phrases of different length, from as few as 2 syllables to as many as 11 or 12 syllables, having every pattern of stressed and unstressed in between. Textual stress, you learn by studying these examples, is achieved by height of pitch, length, and of the duration of individual notes, as well as melismas of as few as 2 to as many as 8 or 10 notes. And then in addition, we find that certain theologically important words are highlighted sometimes by extended melismas called fitas, which can include as many as 50 or 60 or 70 notes. In this hymn, we don't have an example of that, but other hymns do have that, and it's a beautiful thing when you see one of these fitas and you see the word Lord or God or glory or light, these key words, and the artist is just reveling in this beautiful expression, this highlighting of this theologically important word. So, if our task is to write easily singable, vocally easily singable melodies for liturgical texts that we want to make comprehensible and which at the same time elegantly and correctly inflect and articulate the text, the Znamenny system of chantlets must absolutely be given very strong consideration. And I hope that there are composers present in this audience who are beginning to see the possibilities inherent in what I'm talking about here. So, in the time we have remaining, we will turn to phrase-by-phrase consideration of the dogmatic in tone 6. You have your example in Slavonic as your example 6, and your example in English is example 9. Already after I had sent this to Kurt for copying, it occurred to me that, it would have been really nice to put them side by side. But sorry, that was a lapse. I do have, however, a PowerPoint here that takes each phrase one by one, and we can kind of talk about them with a little bit of elaboration. We'll go as time permits us to do. So we have the first phrase, who will not bless you, O all holy Virgin? So we have two subphrases, two chantlets, if you will. The first one being an antecedent, the second one being a consequent, cadencing on the note D, which is one of the most frequent cadential notes in tone 6. We can identify the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllable using Father Ephraim's system, and we would then have in Slavonic, we would have 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1. In English, we have 1, 0, 1, 1, 1. So in order to make, and we have fewer syllables in English, so in order to make this phrase, or this phrase, into this phrase, we can make it work rather well, just as you see it here. Because there's a strong correlation. There are two pickups, then there's a strong correlation here. Who will not bless you? Because it is a paradox here. Who will not bless you? And this is a kind of a we can you can construe this as a subsidiary accent, so it could be a strong syllable, and then you have a strong syllable here. So this actually works rather well. The next subphrase could conceivably. Wait a minute, did we skip one? Yeah. Well, here's an interesting illustration. The pattern in Slavonic and English, both in terms of syllables and their stress pattern is identical. It's 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So you say, well, what's the problem? You say, oh, Holy Virgin. Well, that works, and the reason I did it that way is because, if you remember back in our list of all the occurrences of the Pauk Veliki, which is this do, ti, do, re, mi, re, do, re. Everywhere, this is the pattern. In other words, the stress comes here, the unstressed syllable comes here, and it's a melisma. In no case, none whatsoever, is there a separate syllable on here. The other example that we looked at, example 4, that was previously done by someone, said, Virgin. You see the problem? It's illegal, so to speak, to divide this chantlet into 2 syllables. Why is it illegal? Well, because simply it isn't done. If you're using the lexicon, the orthography, if you will, of Znamenny notation, can't be done. And you notice that no matter how carefully you sing it, if you put an unstressed syllable at the end here, it will get stressed. Virgin. It's just hard to avoid. So, what do we do? By the way, this chantlet called the Pauk Veliki, those of you who are Russians, it does not mean great spider, like a tarantula. According to Mitalov, Pauk comes from the Greek Pavel, or please correct me if I'm saying that wrong, which means pause. Okay, so it's one of those Russian words that somehow was shaped out of the Greek. And we may not, however, want to give that many notes to an unstressed syllable jin, because we would have to go virgin. So what do we do? Well, we could use a totally different, we could use a different form of the pauk, which instead of the great pauk, we use a ordinary pauk. And it would sound something like this. Holy Virgin. It's a possibility. Or what we actually did here is we used a totally different cadential chantlet, which is what the solution that was adopted here. So the first part of this is similar here, but this is a valid chantlet that has the pattern 0, 1, 0. Okay? Oh, Holy Virgin. Okay? These are some of the artistic kind of choices that one has to make when dealing with these sorts of adaptations. Well, how are we doing on time? We could spend, if this were actually a composition seminar, we could go through the entire Theotokia Dogmatica, which is what I did, phrase by phrase, and picking up some of these principles. Just wanted to mention, but we will have to make it short. Just wanted to point out that there's this in the second phrase on your most pure childbearing, that this chantlet here called the podderzhka, or support. Occurs in so many different ways in the examples. Again, if you refer back to our inventory of occurrences, you see all kinds of different, you have strong syllables falling on the last note, you have weak syllables falling on the last note, you see sometimes a syllable here, as it is here, on this repeated little syncopation, sometimes not. Sometimes there's just one syllable, so it would go, you just re-articulate it. And it's a very characteristically lovely move there. So as you see this, we have 3 occurrences of this in the dogmatic. You will see that in English, we used different iterations, if you will, of this chantlet. So I think what we should do now is, in the interest of time, is to ask our resident Znamenny quartet to come up here and to sing for you the finished product, so to speak. And then I just have a few remarks to make at the very end, and we can move on to our next session.
Who will not bless you, O Holy Virgin? Who will not sing your most pure chant-bearing? For the only begotten Son, who shone forth tirelessly from the Father, He Himself came forth from you, O pure Lady, inexpressibly made flesh. He is by nature God, and by nature He became man for our sake, not divided into 2 persons, but without confusion, made known in 2 natures. Beseech Him, O august and all-blessed Lady, that our souls be granted mercy.
Thank you. That's a joy to hear it sung for the first time, other than in my head. So, in conclusion, what are the successes and benefits of this presentation? Well, I think you will agree that it has some of the ones that I outlined already, shaping, inflection, contouring of each phrase. There are some parallel structures, musical structures, that emphasize the textual structures. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, I can tell you, and I heard them myself, that in a few instances where there are some difficult spots, and the solutions that I adopted perhaps need to be looked at again. There's a few weak spots in this. But essentially, once a a hymn like this is worked out in its unison form, then we can use it for polyphonic arrangements. There is this marvelous set of the eight Dogmatica in particular by Kostajski. He has a 2-part version, a 3-part version, and a 4 to 8-part version, or 4 to 6-part version, that are some of the most astounding. They remind me, of what Bach did with chorale preludes, what Kostajski did with Znamenny Chants, polyphonically. It's just absolutely out of this world. But we need to have these core melodies first. We can't take the polyphonic arrangement and somehow shoehorn the English text into it. We need to start at this stage. So these are the challenges. And there are many in this. I mentioned at the outset that this is just barely begins to scratch the surface of the Znamenny system. What I did here with this hymn. We need complete inventories of the chantlets for each tone, categorized by numbers of syllables, accentuation patterns, exactly the kind of lexicon that Father Ephraim and Jessica have compiled for Byzantine chant. And then we need a careful analysis of all of these formulas based on their pneumatic construction so that we don't inadvertently create violations, which will come back. This is what's beautiful about this. They'll come back to bite us if we are careless about the way we use this material. Because after all, we realize that this material has been around for centuries. Centuries. It's hard for Americans to think of things that have been around for centuries. But they've been very polished and honed and worked out. So it would behoove us to learn as much as we can about that system. And then we can start, once we've gone through the adaptive stage, then composers can start using this material to compose new melodies, fresh melodies. When will that happen? We're impatient people living in the modern age. It could happen next year, it could happen 10 years, it could not happen for 100 years. But it's something that we cannot ignore. Then, once we have these melodies, we need singers with experience to learn them and to sing, to learn to love them and to sing them well. Just as, if you've ever gone to a Carpatho-Rusin parish and they sing the Dogmatica by heart. In Pittsburgh, they sing them by heart. Just your congregations. I was in a situation in Pittsburgh where there were several hundred people in a church. They all knew the Znamenny Dogmatica in the particular Carpatho-Rusin recension, and they all sang it in English by heart. So they've been doing it for a while. And then finally, clergy and faithful need to be introduced or reintroduced to these melodies and educated to their superiority, perhaps, in certain cases, to the phrasal chants that we're also familiar and devoted to, because in certain points of the service calls for this kind of extra solemnity, feasts, dogmatica, doxastica feasts, when it's called for. And let's consider that 100 or 150 years ago, Western-style iconography, or Western-style paintings, you might say, had all but replaced traditional iconography in most Orthodox churches. And that it was only through a concerted historical, practical, educational, and spiritual effort that traditional iconography made its return and is taking root here in North America. I hope that some of the thoughts that I've shared with you this morning may inspire those of you, particularly of the younger generation, to begin a similar process in the realm of liturgical music. And I wish we had time for questions. I know Larissa is standing there with her big stopwatch. But I'll be around. Come by and visit Musica Russica. We can talk about these things. If any of you have a particular interest in working on something collaboratively, by all means, let's continue the conversation. So, thank you.